Hi and welcome back to a new video. Today we will talk about and look at the MSI Delta 15, which I think is a very interesting and also impressive notebook. It's featuring the Ryzen 7 5800H, which is the CPU we already featured in previous videos on my channel in different notebooks. This was sent over by AMD, so thank you very much AMD for providing this sample to us for the testing, because it's not only featuring the AMD CPU, but at the same time also featuring an AMD GPU, the 6700M. And even though you could assume that this has the same performance as a normal 6700, RX 6700, it's more on par with the performance of an RX 6600 when it comes to the desktop performance. Still, if you look at the dimensions of the device with about 35 × 25 centimeters, but only 19 millimeters in height and a weight of below 2 kg, I think the performance you're getting for the form factor should be quite interesting and also quite impressive. The RX 6600M is featuring 36 compute units with 2300 shaders, 2300 MHz game boost, 80 MB Infinity cache and 10 GB of GDDR6 memory. Even though we have a very strong GPU in there, we also have an APU in there, the Ryzen 7 5800H. With the 8 cores and 16 threads clocking up to 4.4 GHz using the Zen 3 architecture and a TDP of 45 watt, we already know that the 5800H is a very strong CPU for notebooks. The Delta 15 also features a quite impressive and also quite interesting IPS panel, which has a 1080p resolution and 240 Hz refresh rate, even though I doubt that in most of the games you will be able to reach 240 FPS, but maybe if you're playing something like CSGO. The Delta 15, in this particular version, it's version 008, is featuring 2 memory sticks with 8 GB each as ODIMMs, which means that you could theoretically upgrade these. They are running DDR4 3200 CL22, which is okay, I guess, for a notebook. But 16 GB could be on the edge if you're maybe doing content creation, and in this way you might think about upgrading to maybe 32 or up to 64 GB. If that's easy and if that's possible, we will check out later when we're disassembling the device. The connectivity should be okay and sufficient. It's not too much, but we have 2 times Type A and Type C ports, USB 3.2 generation 2. Wi-Fi 6E, Bluetooth 5.2, and you can have HDMI 4K at 60 Hz and DisplayPort using the USB 3.2 Type-C connector. In this configuration we have one NVMe M.2 drive included, which features a capacity of 1 TB. Since I'm still a big fan of PUBG and playing this almost on a daily basis, that's why I also picked this as a first test, because I have the best relation to this game to judge if it feels smooth or not. And in PUBG, at least I can tell that 1080p is the perfect resolution for this device, because a higher resolution would lead to quite bad FPS. This is with the esports settings, which means that I'm running 1080p resolution and a mix of mid and low settings for best visibilities of the enemies, while running high anti-aliasing. The FPS are typically somewhere in the range of 80 to maybe 85 on average, and 1% low is in the range of 40 to 50, which I think that is enjoyable. It's enjoyable enough that you could take this device over the weekend and just enjoy some times with your friends and still play around PUBG. That's absolutely fine. Remnant from the Ashes also delivers very smooth and enjoyable FPS, about 100 FPS on average, and about 60 and 1% low. That is with 1080p and mid settings. I guess you could even ramp this up to high or ultra. It would still probably feel enjoyable. Testing Far Cry 6, I ran into some issues, because even though I selected the 6700M right here as a video adapter, because you can also switch to the APU if you wanted to, I only had the performance of the APU. The solution was to go to the graphics settings. Even though this is a German Windows, you just have to go to the graphics settings in Windows and then add Far Cry 6 as an app. And on options, you have to set this to high performance to make sure that it's running on the 6700M. Even setting this in the AMD driver didn't help. This was the correct solution to fix the problem. And now with these settings, this looks much better. Now about 70 FPS average and 52 in the 1% low. That is absolutely enjoyable with 1080p and high settings. While performing all the gaming benchmarks, I kept hardware info open in the background for almost 1 hour. The peak CPU clock was, as expected, at 4.4 GHz, so that's perfectly in line. CPU temperature peaked out at about 70 degrees Celsius, which I think is cool as well, especially if you compare this to most of the Intel notebooks. They always typically peak out somewhere between 90 and 100 degrees Celsius, so this is rather cool. CPU package power as expected at the 45 watt TDP, so that's also in line. Going to the GPU, we had a peak GPU temperature below 60 degrees Celsius, and you can also see that the GPU is allowed to consume almost 60 watt. One thing which could also be interesting is looking at the M.2 SSD, especially looking at the peak read and write rates, which we had during the normal operations, so launching different games and everything. You can see that not even 500 megabyte per second read were necessary and 100 megabyte per second write. So considering that there is a quite quick M.2 drive in there, this is perfect, and there's still a lot of headroom for the future. Also, the peak M.2 temperature with 55 degrees Celsius is very good for notebook. In our 20 single-threaded test, one core typically boosts to about 4.2 GHz, sometimes just below 4.3 GHz. As expected, the single-threaded performance is really high, 537 points, and that's about like 20 points above a 9900 KS, which is very impressive. Also, multi-threading is quite strong. Obviously, this will be limited by the cooling and also by the 45 watt TDP, but this is still about 10 to 20% above a Ryzen 5 2600X, which nowadays is still a strong desktop gaming CPU. The BIOS menu is clean and tidy. If you're looking for something, and it could be like storage information where you can see that one SSD is in there, the second slot is empty, system information will show the memory, for example, but there's nothing else you can basically change. One interesting option could be the resizable bar support, which is also there, but apart from that, there is not really anything you could adjust in BIOS. Enough testing, talking and benchmarking. I think Sheik already fell asleep listening to my blah blah. So let's get to the interesting point and open up notebook, see how it's built inside. The Delta 15 is rather easy to open. You have 15 normal Phillips screws on the back. Simply take your iFixit tool if you have one and open the back panel. After opening up the cover, we cannot really see that much because most of the components are covered with this like shielding foil, whatever. We have two heat sinks, left and right. The right one right here is a bit smaller. Well, the fan is the same size, but the heatsink is a bit smaller than on the left side. We have a big battery pack on the bottom with about 80 watt hour. We have a speaker on the right and on the left. And by the way, the speaker design is quite nice. So it's quite easy to locate, for example, enemies, where the steps are coming from, where the shots are coming from. So the sound design on this notebook is very good. There's also the Wi-Fi module here. And one more feature I would like to highlight is this tiny switch, which you can also access through this tiny hole with like a paper clip, for example. And this basically disconnects the battery from the notebook if, I don't know, it's stuck in some certain state and you have to do like a hard reset, then you can press this button through the tiny hole in the back and this way like disconnect the battery from the entire system to perform a hard reset. That is a very, very cool feature. One thing I don't like that much is the fact that the mainboard is basically flipped in the mounting orientation, which means that you pretty much have to completely disassemble this thing before being able to like upgrade anything. So I have to remove all the screws and all those like tiny cables that are sitting in here everywhere. This is how you would probably end up with your motherboard after flipping this around. So you have to remove all of these connectors. Also the Wi-Fi module has to be unplugged. You have to remove the cable from this hole. Then there's still a cable attached to here. I will leave this on. But this way you could probably access the memory to replace those SODIMMs to, for example, upgrade to up to 64 gigabyte. There's the installed M.2 drive, and here you could upgrade to a second M.2 drive if you wanted to. Otherwise, the cooling solution is quite clean and I think quite impressive when it comes to the thermals, at least looking at the temperatures. I think I was very pleased. GPU sitting underneath this area and the CPU sitting underneath this area. To put the performance of the 6700M further into perspective, we're performing a 3D Mark times by a GT1 graphics test. This has about 20 FPS on average, which is on par with a GTX 1070 desktop. Overall, the MSI Delta 15 is a very solid device. The price point is about €1900, which is certainly not cheap, but you're getting very solid performance, and overall I think the entire package is very solid. Like literally with the aluminum case and the very solid display, even though you could debate if 240Hz really makes sense in such a device, because most of the time, at least if it's a more recent game, you will not be able to hit 240 FPS constantly in such a system. So even, I guess, 120Hz IPS panel would be absolutely sufficient. Otherwise, it's quite impressive that you're getting like GTX 1070 desktop performance in such a small thing with not that high power consumption, because the GPU consumes about 60 watt peak. Comparing that with a GTX 1070, I think that is quite impressive. One thing I'm not that happy about though is how to upgrade the Delta 15. Even though I have to point out that MSI is not advertising this. Even if you're looking at a manual, you will not find anything in there about how to upgrade this, because maybe that's not their intention that you're upgrading this. I guess the reason why you have those sockets for the memory slots and also the M.2 slots is just for the different configurations they might offer. But you could upgrade it if you want to, up to 64GB memory and 2 times M.2. However, this is very difficult. You have to completely disassemble the device, take out a lot of tiny cables, and I also want to point out, because that's something I didn't cover in the video, when I first reassembled it and tried to power it on, it didn't work, because I somehow did not plug the battery cable perfectly back in. And then I had to reassemble it, check all the cables, found that one connector was not plugged properly, and then everything was working out fine. But if you have zero experience in working with like the tiny stuff in notebooks, the tiny cables and everything, it might not be a good idea to open this and try to upgrade this. This is something you should only do if you have experience in this field. So upgradability is not really there. Even though you could do it in theory, it's a bit too complex, I guess, because the flipped mainboard is not ideal. Otherwise, I think it's a very solid thing. If that's something for you, you could certainly get it. All right, thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Bye-bye.